our very first speaker, Anja Jacobsen, who will tell us about two very tiny topics, Copenhagen and Niels.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to the Handbook. I was invited to write a piece about Copenhagen, and I would say very soon that piece would also have to deal with Niels Bohr. So that's why I call it Copenhagen and Niels Bohr. Thank you also for the invitation to come to this conference. I will speak about this topic. My plan is to, apart from Copenhagen and Niels Bohr and the Institute, I will dwell a little bit on Christian Bohr, Niels Bohr's father, as a role model for Niels Bohr. And I've been inspired by Stefano Staki's paper in the Handbook, where he, at some point, he points to the fact that Niels Bohr switches from an ontological description of quantum physics to an epistemological description, and he says that he was able to do that must have had its origin in his peculiar philosophical background. So I will briefly touch upon that. Niels Bohr as a philosopher. Then, of course, there are aspects of Niels Bohr's interpretation of quantum physics. I think I will skip that so that we can have time for perhaps one question. And then, of course, Copenhagen was also important after Bohr died. Still, new interpretations of quantum mechanics, proponents of new ideas, would like to have the physicists in Copenhagen, their view on their new ideas. So I would end by briefly taking the point of view of Copenhagen in the quantum controversy in the 1960s, and I will take the example of OH23. Okay, so why was Copenhagen an important place in the interpretation of quantum physics? It's an unlikely event that Copenhagen became the leading center of quantum physics, really. So how could that happen? So we have to go back to World War I, where Denmark and the other Nordic countries were neutral. That meant at the end of the war, they sort of thought, it's payback time, we have benefited from this economically, so we should help restaurate European culture, including the sciences, after the war. In Denmark, a very favorable science policy was set up. The Rask Ørsted Foundation was meant to support daily science within international science, and Bohr benefited a lot from that. And then it was important that Niels Bohr and Harald Bohr made sure that Copenhagen could become a very important venue in the interwar years, where also German scientists, notably in hindsight Heisenberg, could participate. Because Germany was, of course, weakened after the war, and German scientists were excluded from the scientific community. So this became very important. And Niels and Harald exploited this favorable science policy to focus on that. Then it's very important that in Copenhagen there was a favorable attitude towards the new quantum theory. So I call Bohr Mr. Quantum himself, because he was very open-minded. Well, he has just published the atomic model, and he was very open-minded towards radical change in physics. So we see that in many places. For example, in this letter to McLaren in 1913, he writes, "We agree about the necessity of new assumptions. But do you think that such horrid assumptions that I have used necessary? For the moment, I'm inclined to most radical ideas, and I do consider the application of the mechanics as only of formal validity." So this is important because, for example, in Sweden, where you would also have a favorable science policy, the Swedish physicists were originally rather skeptical towards quantum physics, so that became important as well. Then, as I've come to learn during my research into that topic the last year, and so I think confirm what philosophers would say about Niels Bohr, that he was as much a philosopher as he was a physicist. I'll come back to that. So, and that paired with his high status in the scientific community, of course, Then there is the Copenhagen interpretation, named after Copenhagen. And here I just suggest that this was the philosophical ideas that were fostered here by Bohr, Heisenberg, and Pauli, and by which all other interpretations were later measured, we could say. So, but mentioning Heisenberg and Pauli as well leads me to also mention that the visitors in Copenhagen really made it the place. So, and this is a picture from the conference there in 1929. So, Bohr could attract, with this science policy that was available in Denmark, he could attract eminent physicists from all over the world that came to Copenhagen for a short or longer periods. And Kosciuszko has pointed to the fact that they talked about what they were doing in Copenhagen as Knabenphysik. They were boys physics because most of them were under 35 years. And Heisenberg has called this spirit that they experienced in Copenhagen. There was this collaborative spirit, informal attitude, atmosphere. They called it the Copenhagen spirit. So Bohr really facilitated this collaborative work, or he really proposed to do, he really was a proponent of free research when they could come to Copenhagen, and he would facilitate their stay and their travel and so on. So the visitors were hugely important for making it the place. Of course, the frame of this collaborative environment was the Institute for Theoretical Physics. That was finished in 1921. And of course, Bohr was very much influenced or inspired by Ernest Rutherford in how to build this institute. And he had just come back from England, where he had been a postdoc with Rutherford and was inspired in how he ran his experimental laboratory there. What I want to suggest that Niels Bohr was also very much inspired by his father's institute, or where Niels Bohr grew up, because the way he built this institute, only half of the space was reserved for research facilities. The other half was for living quarters. So the Bohr family lived on the first floor. On the top floor, assistants could stay, and the technicians and so on. And I think that's a copy of how his father had arranged it, or how it was arranged when he grew up in his father's institute. Because his father was a prominent professor of physiology, and he was the leader of the medical institute in this building, famous or prominent building in downtown Copenhagen. The family lived on the ground floor, 12-room flat, and then on the top floor lived the anatomical professor, and in between there were teaching facilities with the tall anatomical theater and so on. In the courtyard there was another building with a physiological laboratory where Christian Bohr did his research in physiology, where the assistants lived, and at this period they lived here from 1885 to 1911, when Christian Bohr died prematurely of a heart attack. This was crowded with students, and he had assistants, and in the evenings doctors that worked at the hospitals would come around for their research. So he was working round the clock, and there was a blurred division between family life and work. So I think Niels Bohr copied that in his institute. So I want to dwell a little bit more with Christian Bohr as a role model. Yes, so he established experimental physiology in Denmark. I think there are some striking parallels, so that Niels Bohr, as a kickstart to his career, he could have had his father as a role model, because Niels Bohr established modern physics in Denmark, particularly theoretical physics. So Christian Bohr was very active in science policy. This was a period where, in the end of the 19th century, it was very difficult to expand for successful in that regard, and one of his key values in his scientific engagement was free research. Bohr was an eminent fundraiser for theoretical physics at the Institute, and he facilitated free research for all the visitors that came to Copenhagen. And then I also think that they Bohr copied the way the Institute was where he lived as a child. The line between work and family life was blurred. President Bohr, at the end of the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, he worked actively for internationalization and defied there was a prevailing anti-German atmosphere in Denmark after Denmark lost the war to the Prussians in 1864, when he defied that. He went abroad to Germany and studied with the leading German physiologists and made sure they could come to Copenhagen for an international conference. Harold Bohr and Niels Bohr worked actively for internationalization, particularly when talking about the war years, and made sure the German scientists that were otherwise excluded from the scientific community could come to Denmark. So, at least there are some striking parallels, and for me it makes a lot of sense that Niels Bohr, the eminent scientific leader, didn't just drop from the sky like a Danish flag, but that he could actually have had some room. And I've been inspired by Stefano Snarki's paper, because he says there is this peculiar philosophical background to Niels Bohr's philosophy that made him able to switch from an ontological interpretation to an epistemological interpretation. So Bohr was inclined, there are some evidence of that he philosophized very early on. He discussed philosophy of biology with his father. He was very interested in philosophy of mathematics when he started studying at university. And apparently around the time of the structural defense of free electrons in metals in 1911, he wanted to write a book about his philosophy. He didn't do that. Instead, he busied himself with physics. He went abroad and invented the atomic model. And then he only returned to the idea of writing a book about his philosophy 20 years after. This was the time after quantum mechanics was invented, and he had started to build his interpretation that was then published in his talks in the Como lecture. Yeah, so Bohr had a philosophy, and he returned to that philosophy at the time when the physicists started interpreting the quantum physics. And we can see that in the business. For example, this one to his friend Carl Wilhelm Hussein in Sweden, when his Como lecture was received, he wrote to his friends, similar to this. It's a general attitude which I've had at heart during all these years that I have been occupied with quantum theory. As we have already discussed years ago, so they met for the first time in 1911 in Copenhagen for a mathematical conference, and so Hussein had known about the Bohr's philosophical idea then. So I want to suggest that a seed to Niels Bohr's philosophy was these discussions he had with his father about the philosophy of biology around 1910 at least. So, because President Bohr faced epistemological problems in biology, there were these two rival descriptions. Of course, he was an experimental physiologist, so his focus was to get as far as possible to explain the mechanisms or the processes in the organism by means of physics and chemical methods. But then there was a rival descriptions, a teleological description, where when you look at a body, an organism, it seems as if these processes that goes on are also, they have a purpose to sustain life of that organism. So, and bridges to rival discussions. And Christian Bohr started mentioning this at the time when they began to discuss these things around 1910, just a year before he died. Niels Bohr returns to this after his core lecture in this paper, for example, from 93, Light in Life. He says, the role which teleological arguments play in biology reminds one of the endeavors formulated in the correspondence argument to take the quantum of action into account in a rational manner. So he likened, so to speak, the teleological description in biology with the given, the new situation in quantum physics that comes about because of the quantum of action. Okay, so this is, yeah, okay, I understand. Yes. Yes, so because the crux of the matter for Niels Bohr with the quantum physics was the discovery of the quantum of action. And he says this is what dictates the new situation in quantum physics. Because it introduces what he called an indivisibility, a new indivisibility. Because you can no longer, if you have a measurement situation, you can no longer divide the situation into object and observer. So instead you have to look at it as a sort of whole, the observer and the object together in a, you could actually say what Frank Lalo mentioned yesterday, in an entangled situation, so to speak. And that's because, of course, of the smallness, you could say, of the quantum of action. You cannot ignore the interactions between the observer and the object. And therefore, there is this introduction of a new object-subject problematic. And you have to watch, you have to see philosophy as a way to come to terms with this. How can we then have objectivity in quantum physics? So I won't talk much more about that. Only to say, again, it's around the time of the Como lecture, no, here, that it becomes clear that his interpretation is an epistemological interpretation. So it's indeed, he writes that to his old teacher and good friend, the philosopher Harold Hoeffding. It's indeed in particular the purely epistemological side of the analysis of concepts that I have preoccupied myself with in this work. So this is the time. Okay, now I want to switch to the 1960s in Copenhagen and focus on OH23. So this is a picture of Niels Bohr, Margrethe Bohr, and OH23, who accompanied Niels Bohr to the US in '57. And OH23, sorry, I have learned that he is dead, but I don't know when. So he worked as one of the last assistants of Bohr from 52 to 62. After Bohr died, he went abroad and got a position in New York. And then he started working with Anja Jacobsen on non-local variables. At the same time, he wrote a dissertation about quantum physics and the philosophical tradition, which he sent to Copenhagen to have it evaluated in Copenhagen. So very soon after he came to the States, he encounters another way of looking at the philosophical ideas in Copenhagen that he was interested in. Okay. So his friend, the professor of philosophy, Johannes V. Hansen in Copenhagen, he writes home to me. So, for example, in '64, at the time that around the gas inequality.
It's gone.
It's gone? The sound? Okay.
Allô, allô?
Oui,
Ah, ça y est, je vous entends. Enfin.
c'est pas sûr, parce que c'est moi qui ai parlé en vidéo.
Oui, oui, j'entends pas le conférencier, je vous entends vous. Oui.
Okay, but I can say that the main thesis of O. Peterson's dissertation was that what is it here? The advent of quantum physics meant the end of ontological philosophy. So this is very much in line with Bohr's interpretation of quantum physics.
Le goût de ma contre, je peux vraiment rien. D'accord. D'accord. Ok. Allez. Eh ben, il est encore plus. Bon, mais on n'est pas obligé, je sens que ça t'ennuie, ce truc, ma réponse.
Okay, so very soon he starts writing home to his philosophy friend that the last few months have been a lesson learned for me about how easily it is to turn dogmatic when things no longer grow. He has talked to Handbook. I have often thought about what would Bohr have said to the new ideas. So of course this is always the case with proponents of new ideas. They wanted to know how Bohr thought about it. And the next best thing if they couldn't get hold of Niels Bohr, they would ask somebody who knew him very well. So ironically, that could have been O. Peterson himself. Anyway, so he continues after talking about the work he did with Yakir Hakunov from non-known variables, that so far I have not written to the physicists in Copenhagen, for it is a delicate matter to touch Bohr's fundamental ideas. So a lot of proponents of new ideas would have experienced that. Okay, so he sends this dissertation with the main thesis, which is very much in line with Bohr's thought, to Copenhagen, and there's a physicist in the institute, Mogens Pihl, who is the head of the commission, and he writes an evaluation where he starts out saying, the author does not attempt or pretend to interpret quantum physics in a new way. You can almost feel...
Is it good or bad? Is it a positive evaluation?
Yes, very positive, very positive. He also sent his dissertation to Bohr, and apparently Bohr wrote 2 long letters with objections. He sticks to the ontological. Not surprising. Okay, so this defense attracted journalists. It was reported in the newspaper. So there was this drawing. Here we have O. Peterson defending. Oh, yeah. Here we have O. Bohr in the audience. Apparently, O. Bohr really regretted that O. Peterson ran away to America. He didn't want O. Peterson for the institute, really. Here we have another assistant of Niels Bohr the last years, namely Jan Kalkar, who was ex-editorial for the defense. And here we have 2 philosophers. Johannes Hansen, who was the other head of the commission, and Jørgen Jørgensen, who is on the left. Okay, so this is my last slide. So the journalists were attracted to this defense because they had really expected that The dissertation had summoned, in particular, the young atomic physicists for a fierce debate. With foreigners like Feyerabend and Bunge, the later years have shown attempts against the Copenhagen doctrine. And among some of the young atomic physicists, there is a certain desire to test the strength of what is considered to be dogmatics. So that didn't happen. So Berlingske Tidende quoted some of what the comments that were said during the defense, and Mogens P. started out by saying, when we in Copenhagen first heard about your dissertation, we hoped that now came the book proper about Niels Bohr's philosophy. That, I don't know, still remains to happen. And Jørgen Kjærgaard, who was ex-auditor, was critical of his review of the classical philosophical tradition. That was too brief, he said, but the work presents you as a worthy disciple of a great wizard. So they were probably relieved that he didn't write about his work with Here in this dissertation, and they were very favorable towards it. Yes, I think I will stop with that and see anyone.
Great, so we do have time for some questions.
Thank you for your talk. What do you think about the relation with Heidegger?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know much. Heidegger.
Bohr
I don't. Heisenberg? Heidegger. I don't know about Heidegger, I have to admit. Yeah, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian. So, but I have an interest in this historical stuff.
I saw Alexei and Negotier, and then
It's maybe something on the side, but I mean, this phenomenon of professors having apartments in the institutes, it's a very typical German institution building laboratory revolution. So, so in every country with immortal German parents will do this. But I mean, before you talk, I imagine how it could work for physicists. But since you mentioned anatomical theater, I started wondering, what did it mean for Niels Bohr to grow up as a kid in a house where there are dissections of corpses, ghosts, and zombies?
Well,
How could someone bring up kids in this? So what did it mean that?
Exactly. I think that the thing was that Harold and Niels, they were sent away to the countryside every time they had to write a dissertation or study for the exam. So I think it was extremely lively at this place. So I don't know about dissecting.
Well, I mean, don't be
yes.
clear what we're going to do.
Yeah. Exactly. So it was a busy place.
Gautier and
Yes. Can we say that the Copenhagen interpretation is the first interpretation of quantum mechanics? And if yes, what do we do with, for example, the Bohr interpretation of the wave function?
Well, it depends on what you mean by Copenhagen interpretation. And you could say, as Christian have pointed out, that basically it was only named that from the 50s on, when new interpretations started arriving. Then it was called the Copenhagen interpretation. So, and it involved probably also von Neumann's axioms and so on. So, but I guess, yeah, I don't think it's Bohr's and Heisenberg's ideas that are. I don't know. We can always debate them.
was born this way by the French transportation.
Yes.
Copenhagen, that's a theory.
I don't want to claim that this was the first or anything. No.
Christian, and then last one.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anja. I'm sure you're very aware of this. I would like your opinion on it. One of the things that strikes me about Bohr is many physicists obviously wanted to have philosophical discussions with him. So you have written on Rosenfeld. Do you have any sense of what Rosenfeld thought of Pedersen's book? I imagine it would have enraged him given his strong dialectic materialist views. And it leads me to the question, people who conversed with Bohr seem to leave with rather different views of what he had said. What's your take on this, and do you know what Rosenfeld, also a former assistant, made of Pedersen's work?
It's funny you should ask that. Yeah, of course, Rosenfeld was invited to be on the commission,
Right.
but he declined the offer. I don't know exactly why. Most people sent his evaluation immediately to Rosenfeld when he had it. think it had, I think they were all afraid that this was the non-local variable interpretation that was sent over the pond. I think, and he didn't want to go into that. I think at the time, I don't recall if it was Bohr or Handbook who came to, it's probably a Handbook who came to Copenhagen and talked about the Bohr-Handbook effect. And Rosenberg was extremely critical, and so he didn't, and he was working with a Handbook, so maybe it's about that, I don't know. So he didn't have anything to do with it. And in fact, Mogens Pihl and Johannes Schmidt Hansen, who were heads of the commission, were very relieved that he had declined.
Ah,
So, yeah.
right,
So,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, let's thank Anja again.
Yes.